Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books in the Poetry Center of St. Louis. Are proud to host former Executive Director of the Poetry Society of America, Alice Quinn, and poets and contributors Traci Brimhall, Aleksandar Hemon, Vincent Katz, Dana Levin, Dante Micheaux, Tommy Orange, Carl Phillips, Diane Seuss, Tess Taylor, and Kevin Young, who will read their selections from the new book, Together in a Sudden Strangeness: America's Poets Respond to the Pandemic. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank all of our supporters for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We offer curbside pickup and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. We are incredibly happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. And this event in particular would not be possible. I mean, it would be possible, but it is even more special to have it virtual because we have authors joining us from all over the world tonight. We hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or for any of your friends at left-bank.com. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating, and it allows us to keep this event going. I also want to thank the Poetry Center of St. Louis. The Poetry Center is celebrating 75 years of excellence this year. They produce a reading series and are a very important part of the literary community in St. Louis. We are happy to have their support for this event, and I will put a link in the comments for how you can donate to the Poetry Center to help them be able to celebrate another 75 years. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books, and I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. Be sure to follow Facebook, Left Bank Books on Facebook to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. And without further ado, because we have an amazing lineup for tonight, I am going to welcome our fantastic editor, Alice Quinn. If you would all help me in welcoming her to the screen. Alice is the executive director of the Poetry Society of America for 18 years. She was also the poetry editor at the New Yorker from 1987 to 2007, and an editor at Alfred A. Knopf for more than 10 years prior to that. She teaches at Columbia University's School of the Arts and is the editor of a book of Elizabeth Bishop's writings, Edgar Allan Poe and the Jukebox, Uncollected Poems, Drafts, and Fragments, as well as a forthcoming edition of Bishop's Journals. Alice, thank you so much for being here tonight and for making this event happen. It is such a pleasure to have you and to have all of these fantastic authors with us this evening.
Oh, thank you so much, Shane, and Left Bank Books for hosting this event. And particular thanks to Carl Phillips and Dana Levin, our St. Louis poets, for suggesting the event. I'll say just a few words about the book for 3 or 4 minutes. I began my publishing career at Knopf, as you mentioned, and am thrilled that this anthology is a Knopf book. I cannot thank my editor, Deb Garrison, sufficiently. She was my exuberant support and partner every step of the way. A little bit about the book. On March 26th last year, I reached out to 125 poets, asking them all to share email addresses of other poets whom they knew were writing during this time. And in 40 biblical days, gathered 85 poems from the hundreds of poets I corresponded with in that time. Later in the spring, with the death of Breonna Taylor and the killing of George Floyd, we entered a second phase of the pandemic time, that of Black Lives Matter. Many poems in the first iteration of the book spoke to chasms, societal and racial, bleakly revealed in this time: unequal access to food and healthcare, jobs and housing. The second phase poems, 22 of them, which we added for the book in June, addressed all of this more directly, kind of less embryonically. Claudia Rankine's poem Weather, Jericho Brown's Say Thank You, Say I'm Sorry, both commissioned by the New York Times Magazine. Other marvelous poems were first published in the New Yorker, where Kevin Young, also a contributor to this book, is poetry editor. Among them, Ada Limon's The End of Poetry, which Aleksandar Hemon will read tonight, and David Beispiel's Men Waiting for a Train, which Kevin himself will read. But really only a handful of these poems were previously published. There's kind of a cat's cradle quality to the book, poems and poets calling out to each other. There are poems by three doctors, Fadi Judah, Ahmed Majumar, and John Okrent, three poets with the same surname, Patrick and Rowan Ricardo Phillips and Carl Phillips, who is here with us. Poems by a father and daughter. Poems by two couples, Dee Dee and Major Jackson, and Danielle Chapman and Chris Wyman. Poems by poets hailing from all over the country. The poets range in age, background, gender, of course, and poetic style, subject, and perspectives. Leave it to the New Yorker to locate a scholar of anthologies, Claire Bucknell from The Hague, to contextualize the book in terms of its historical lineage and significance. And I just want to quote three points that she makes about anthologies. Etymologically, anthology refers to a collection of flowers, varied species of blooms selected and arranged so that they look like they belong together. Multiplicity has always been a key point, the provision in one volume of very different voices and concerns that nonetheless have some kind of collective force. Anthologies emphasize the diversity of their contributors, the way they range in gender, sexuality, age, and social background. That's certainly true of this book. The poets speak for us if they speak like us, offering through their inclusive coverage a model of society and microcosm. Finally, what anthologies offer is the historical moments seen long-sightedly from many directions, a collective account of the times that's more considered, more patient, and more productively ambiguous than other kinds of record can manage. Truth-telling comes in many forms. Just a word about the title, which is drawn from Pablo Neruda's poem, Keeping Quiet, in a translation by Alistair Reid. The lines that stood out to me when I was working on the book are, for once on the face of the earth, let's not speak in any language. Let's stop for 1 second. It would be an exotic moment, without rush, without engines. We would all be together in a sudden strangeness. Now, a year later, the concluding lines or penultimate lines of this poem really stand out to me. Perhaps the earth can teach us, as when everything seems dead and later proves to be alive. So I want to thank all the poets joining us tonight, all 10 of them who are going to say a few words about their poems and also read a favorite poem by someone else in the anthology. So I'm going to introduce them one by one. Our inaugural reader for tonight is Traci Brimhall, whose latest book is Sodad from Copper Canyon Press. She is an associate professor and director of creative writing at Kansas State University. Welcome, Traci.
Thank you, Alice. And thank you for asking to see something for this anthology way back in the beginning. I actually wrote more in the beginning than I was able to maintain, but I knew big things were happening. And I love that productive ambiguity that you mentioned about anthologies, and wanted to make sure I made something and noticed something. One of the things that comes up in my poem is a prairie burning. I live in the Flint Hills of Kansas, and so every April, the hills are set on fire, and it looks black for a week or so, and then everything comes back electric green. I think of it as like the Midwest's like Phoenix metaphor, but everything, goes very dark for a while before it comes back in this very electric shade of itself. So there is a mention of a prairie fire and it being pink and black, and that's very much what the Kansas sunset looks like in April, the black hills and the pink sky. It's very beautiful, but also, of course, rebirth is painful, and as the caterpillars on my kitchen counter can attest, it's pretty disgusting to be reborn. So I know it's a difficult process, but it was one of the things I was just trying to think about as I was first writing poems. And I just used the trick of anaphora when I was first trying to get something down, because I wanted to remember what 1 year ago was like. So I used the anaphora of today just to make sure I was getting something out of myself onto the page. So this is Plague Diary. Today, my son fell into the knockout roses, and a tendril of an old idea of heaven preyed on him, and an older idea of forgiveness wept from his leg. Today, beyond the garden, clouds marshaled like white blood cells to an infection, and the sun did its daily dying across the burnt prairie, the pink and black of a basement tattoo parlor where a paraclete needled a psalm into my back. Today, my son and I tugged pansies apart. Their roots knotted like a widow's hair. We pushed them into pots and barrels, brightening, no, shocking, the dull yard with its still winter brown. I wanted to claw out last year's weeds, pull the fat white taproots free like spines, but my son ran inside with his neon sandcastle mold to fill and fill the water and wet whatever could still grow. Today, I walked the worn shadows to the pond and congratulated myself on my attention, my ears tuned to the blackbirds, my eyes catching the hawk. Today, my heart, silly little star cup, measured the odd inches of the crocus. The lamb's ear pushed its silver centimeters toward whatever pilgriming moonlight would come to heal us. But the green disguises of God, who's on his way, but not ready to save us yet, were all I found today. And Alice asked us, and I love this because I've read and dog-eared my copy of the anthology as well, to find another poem to read. And I really, I liked so many of them, and so many of my peers tonight too are also dog-eared in here. But I picked another one to read tonight that also had to do with children, because of course I very much identified with that sheltering in place with a small human thing that was happening, that still is happening. This one is by Nicole Cooley, and it's called At CVS Wearing a Mask, I Buy Plastic Easter Eggs for My Daughters. My boot heels on pavement. The sound drags me back to myself as I walk. The air rinsed cold, near bitter. I shove my hands inside my winter coat, slip latex gloves over my fingers, mask my face. Once, when I was a child, my mother and I lay body to body. Now I feel for the edges of myself, untethered. Houses I walk by are strung with Christmas lights. In New Jersey, we're told to decorate again this April for cheer and hope. 2 years ago in New Orleans, I remember wanting to snap heads off daffodils because my mother was dead, craving that violence. At home, I scrub the plastic eggs, stuff them with chocolate, listen to the news from Queens, the counts of the dead, while thinking about my students. How I wish feeling terrible felt useful, as it did when I was a teenager. Yet this can't be the lesson I teach my daughters. Outside the hospital in Elmhurst, refrigerated trucks in parking lots will house the bodies. Tiny white lights strung on a gutter, a hiss of oxygen. A body looking like it is sleeping but actually dead. My mother when my father found her. Thank you.
Traci, that was beautiful. I'm going to introduce Aleksandar Hemon now. His most recent book is My Parents, an Introduction. This Does Not Belong to You. Published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. He teaches at Princeton University. Welcome, Aleksandar.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you all for being here and having me here. I have to say that I have not been a poet for a long time. One of the many bad things that the pandemic has done to the world is that it made me return to poetry, which I used to practice in my youth. And the reasons are, I suppose, obvious. That I will say that it made me return to the kind of basics of engagement with language. Somehow the heartbeat becomes important, and then the language becomes important. And I also started making music. In any case, my father used to say that there will be everything except for us in the future. And then I remember this, I never actually forgot it, but I remember this within the new context of the pandemic. So this poem is called The Future of Everything. There will be everything, my father used to say, except for us and our lives. This world will look the same trees, clouds, neighborhoods, and plains, but we will not be around to see any of it. This very home will have the same walls, except none of us will be sleeping within. Inside these clothes, there will be nothing. A vacant shirt and suit will stumble forth instead of me, instead of this aching body, in search of memories to fill what's emptied. No one will remember us, not one will recall, because no future will ever notice we are gone. Give me your hand then, so I can hold it, my boy. And I will also read Ada Limon's wonderful poem. There are many ways, at least a few ways, to recognize a great poem. One of the ways for me is to gasp at the end of it in joy and shock of kind of aesthetic bliss. So this is The End of Poetry by Ada Limon. Enough of osseous and chickadee and sunflower and snowshoes, maple and seeds, samara and shoot. Enough chiaroscuro, enough of dust and prophecy, and the stoic farmer and faith in our Father and this of thee. Enough of bosom and bud, skin and God, not forgetting, and star bodies and frozen birds. Enough of the will to go on and not go on, or how a certain light does a certain thing. Enough of the kneeling and the rising and the looking inward and the looking up. Enough of the gun, the drama, the acquaintance's suicide, the long lost letter on the dresser. Enough of the longing and the ego and the obliteration of ego. Enough of the mother and the child and the father and the child. Enough of the pointing to the world, weary and desperate. Enough of the brutal and the border. Enough of can you see me, can you hear me? Enough, I am human. Enough, I am alone and I am desperate. Enough of the animals saving me. Enough of the high water, enough sorrow. Enough of the air and its ease. I am asking you to touch me. Thank you.
Brilliant, brilliant reading. Thank you so much. And thank you, Kevin Young, for publishing that poem in the New Yorker. I'm going to introduce Vincent Katz now, who is a poet and translator, who has published translations of the Roman poet Sextus Propertius. His most recent publication is the book of poems Broadway for Paul from Alfred A. Knopf in 2020. Welcome, Vincent.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's really an honor to read with all these terrific poets. I want to thank Alice for including me in this anthology and Left Bank Books for hosting us. I really love this anthology. I honestly keep it by my bedside, and I've kept reading it ever since it came out. It's really terrific. So I'm going to read my poem that's in the anthology. And I guess what I would say about it is that I tend to write a lot based on my environment. I don't say that I write about it, but it definitely reflects how I feel at the time that I'm writing. So usually I live in New York City, and a lot of my poems, again, I wouldn't say they're about the city, but they're just in the city. And I do write a lot on the street. I like to be in the flux of people and see how that, and the contingency of just seeing things by chance affects what and how I might write. At this point in time, I was actually out in the country, and so it was a different kind of looking altogether, and I started to focus on particular plants and animals. I ended up writing a series of poems on animals, but this one is about a tree. I've been following a magnolia. I've been following a magnolia and the sound of a metal gate. It opens around 7:30 and closes at 5:30. A simple clinking sound defines the day. The top of the tree now hit by sun, the bottom already in shade. We've been watching it all this time we've been in exile together, especially my mother. Every day she reminds us of it. The light licks lower, touching leaves of flowers yet to be, myrtle, low white magnolia petals becoming slightly discolored, and faces. But the main magnolia, so pink and fragrant, is our ever-present reminder of who we are, this group assembled as one. And I like very much the invitation that Alice gave us to read a poem by a fellow colleague in the anthology, but I think that really just accents the quality of an anthology and poems and poets that one might not know before reading them in the anthology. In this case, I'm going to read a poem by Gail Mazer, who's somebody I actually have known for a long time. And I love this poem because it deals with some very difficult topics and in a very humane way, and also just the way she's able to bring nature into the situation, and as well as the poet Robert Creeley, who is somebody whose work I feel very close to, and Gail's husband, who has passed away, and was the painter Mike Mazer. And she's able to do all this in this short poem, also with a sense of humor, which I feel sometimes is what helps us get through. This poem's called Matzah. As if to mock me in my widowhood, as if to deny my pandemic isolation, this huge carton arrives at my door, an absurd cosmic mistake from Yehuda Matzahs, 10 boxes, which should last long enough to get incinerated with me at the old New England cemetery that was once the family farm of poet Robert Creeley's great-grandfather, and where his descendants can be buried together, ad aeternum. Mirabile dictu that Bob and the ashes of my beloved and mine will lie in that pastoral landscape where I like to walk on spring mornings. One of the first arboreal cemeteries, a sanctuary really for mourners, bird watchers, and my friends, the Sunday botanizers. Should I be buried, or should my ashes just be sprinkled about with old dry crumbs of Yehuda's uncalled for, unrisen bread? Such questions never occurred in what we call normal times. When I'd bring cut flowers to lay on our stone, etched with a palette, a brush, a pen, nestled alongside the markers of other Jews and Chinese and Armenians, near Malamute and Achilles Fang and Izzy Stone, far from Longfellow and Mary Baker Eddy, overlooking a pond, which is serene home all summer to a picturesque pair of weeping willows and 2 white swans. Who was the misinformed deliverer of such excess to my door, of these symbols of my people's eternal hardships? Oh, Yehuda Matzahs, Yehuda Matzahs! Yes, in your crisp, hard plenitude, you mock and kind of amuse me, when I'd forgotten how you've always been baked with the salty tears of my people's exodus. But oh, I will eat, and eat alone, until the day I can eat no more of our unleavened bread.
Thank you, Vincent. That's wonderful. I'm going to introduce Dana Levin now of St. Louis. Dana's 4th book is Banana Palace from Copper Canyon Press, a recipient of honors from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Library of Congress, and the Rona Jaffe, Whiting, and Guggenheim Foundations, Dana serves as Distinguished Writer in Residence at Maryville University in St. Louis. Please welcome her.
Hi. Alice, thank you for including me in this book. It's a beautiful book, and the poems in it are so wonderful and varied. And it gives me pleasure to be part of the community that is between these pages. I'll read my poem first. I think the main way that pandemic has affected my consciousness is I'm really aware of living inside of time as if time is a place. And I don't mean just the way sometimes minutes can stretch into hours, as I have barely left my apartment for a year, but I'm also thinking about memory. And because I couldn't go places or see beloved family members who are in California, I spent a lot of time in memory. And this poem begins with a pretty dull activity brought on by pandemic anxiety, lockdown anxiety, but then pretty quickly I go on a journey. This is called As If. I had a lot of time on my hands. So many minutes I couldn't give them away. My natural sloth had ceased meaning, so I turned to domestic industry. Tidying the pantry at midnight, I had 6 boxes of gluten-free penne. I had enough rice and beans. I'd had enough life, hadn't I? It was good to take stock, just in case. I had enough scraps of poems that went nowhere. I had enough memories. And there they were, the 2 labs on Mount Atalaya, 20 years ago, maybe. Black and yellow, stranger dogs without collar. When I started hiking back down, they appeared. One on the left of me and one on the right. Neither lagging much nor leaping ahead. Sometimes they'd cross and recross in back and in front of me till it seemed we flowed down like a braid. And the male was the color of the deep well, and the female the color of dry grass by its mouth. They waited when I got to my car, panting and wagging. Black sun and gold moon, as if I would take them to the water bowl, to the safe cave. I'd been hiking at Atalaya, watchtower in Spanish. Long ago, someone camped up there looking for signs. The smoke that meant fire, the dust kicked up by the hooves of invaders, the steam of a train stopped by men turning the infected away. The black dog behind me, nudging my legs, as if I were a person who took care of other beings. Trust like a terrible grace. And the second poem I'm going to read is by Eliza Griswold. I love the starkness of this poem and also the rhyme scheme and the way that it captures a certain kind of thrumming waiting that I know I was in the first 2 months or so of lockdown when we didn't really know how long things were going to last and before we all got exhausted. This poem is called 6 Months from Patient Zero by Eliza Griswold. Nothing is new. We fear one another without wanting to. Uncertain who is solve and who is threat. Every honest answer is not yet. As avatars, we've grown more intimate. I prefer my avatar to me. Her lashes are longer, though people find her severe. A patient is a person who endures. To be patient is to be willing to endure, to forbear. Thanks.
Thank you, Dana. You know, you and Carl are a great advertisement for St. Louis with your beautiful apartments.
Yes, indeed. Cheap.
Oh, so I'm going to welcome Dante Micheaux now, who is the author of Amorous Shepherd and Circus, which won the 2019 Four Quartets Prize from the Poetry Society of America and the T.S. Eliot Foundation. His other honors include fellowships from Cave Canem Foundation and the New York Times Foundation, and he is very generously joining us from London, where it is considerably past midnight. Welcome, Dante.
Thank you so much, Alice, for having me. Thank you for including me in the anthology. And I also would like to thank the staff at Left Bank Books for organizing this. I am going to read a poem. I'm going to begin by reading a poem by Susan Stewart in the anthology. And I think the great strength of the anthology is the connections made from our various attentions throughout the pandemic. And it's serendipity that there's both a poem in this anthology by Susan Stewart and one by me, because at the time of composing my own poem, I didn't know it would end up in any anthology about the pandemic, and I didn't know that it would be in the same pages with Susan Stewart. Susan makes an appearance in my poem, and so I thought for that connection, I would begin by reading hers. 3 Octets. Natureingang. Almost May. 2 brown trout held on a stringer, the fisherman smiling breakfast around his mask. Stalked and yanked from the frothing eddies, the swarming scuds and the caddisflies. Nodding trillium, ginger, lilies of the valley, upstarts in the here and now of stoppages. One day this song will be merely puzzling. What do they mean by a mask, they'll say. Counting. Models for and models of, neat as toothpicks, safe as houses. The bells of London, the Coinstar change machine, pokers and tongs. This ship hasn't sailed. We were counting on it, counting the minutes and days, hoping it counted and could count. Apples and squares and pies confused with pie, timetables mounting up to clouds. Lucretius. Thus you will learn these things, and with little effort on your part. One thing will clarify another, and dark night will not rob you of your way, and the sun will not blind you, or the river drown you, until you see deeply into the final rule of nature. So things will illuminate other things. And one of the things that has made the pandemic most bearable is, this ability for those of us who learned early to live in books, to seek refuge there. And I found a lot of refuge, one in reading poems, particularly poems that have that sort of heady gorgeousness that a Susan Stewart poem has, and watching what was happening in nature outside my home, and just looking out the window on a daily basis and seeing the emptiness, save the animals. And so my own poem, Corona, comes out of that experience. Starlings, after a mild winter, return to post. A modest house in a curve of road. Days into their speckle, their light load. I am fair witness, almost. How far they come from whichever roost. Remember walking away from where the river flowed? That murmuration the starlings made and owed, not to the sky, but nature itself to boast. I spoke to my neighbor across the fence, kept my distance, he could not name the bird. Near where I live, a hospital of tents, I asked my neighbor if he had heard, hearing things that made no sense, the answer, as expected, not a word. Not a word on a usually busy street. Mosquitoes wake to find there is no human meat. Something about the immunity of a herd. If signs come in threes, this was the third. Nature, true to form, retaliates with heat. There are no people outside to greet. Any attempt to escape deferred. I spoke with friends with wireless fidelity. Zoom in on baby faces laughing. Unlike our callousness toward catastrophe. Better that than politicians lying. Breach the week's cooking with vitality. Master my mastery of loafing. Master my mastery of loafing. Some are guilty, but all are responsible. A generation found its civic lessons dispensable. Inequality, the tie that binds the living. A steward named us suicidal species, unlike the bird with its singing. Perhaps the signs are not discernible. Recidivist behavior is despicable. I spoke to my family who, of course, had misgivings. Forecast to flourish in the next season. Think of all the dinner parties to host. Be ashamed to think such treason. One may as well blaspheme the Holy Ghost. Then, again, there is hope and reason. The starlings, after all, return to post. Thank you.
Your poem, Dante. Just love the rhymes. Thank you so much for those readings. Perfect. I'm going to introduce Tommy Orange now. His debut novel, There, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction. Tommy is an enrolled member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma. He was born and raised in Oakland, California. Hi, Tommy. I think you have to unmute.
Sorry.
Good.
Hey, Alice, thank you for including me on this reading and in this book. Thank you to Left Bank Books and everyone reading tonight. It was strange to be asked to contribute to this book, having never published a poem. So I was very nervous to submit something. But I was already writing something when I was asked. And I think poetry for me is sort of something I was always writing that I didn't consider anything, those things that became poems. And this was one of them. I'm going to read my first published poem, possibly the last. Aftermaths. Some of us are already post-apocalyptic, so the world can't end for us any more than an end can end. But if it does, if the end is doing its ending, if the world becomes without us, we the absent deliverers of the gone, it will at the very least have peace, meaningless peace, animalful peace, smogless, noiseless, plasticless, thunderous peace. Our eyes have never not been wet, but not like this. These mournless tears are worn from screen. What is the drink that poisons the solution for the hungry tongue? And what of touch, and what of flight, and what of seeing the world? Forget the antibodies. What of all the too many bodies? Just what do you mean to do with us? We will bury the truth of our decadence with the truth of our negligence, with the truth of the lives and deaths of our dead. Our bodies will be an old world put to soil, to bloom elsewhere, elsewhen, else what could it mean to have come this far only to wither and choke, hidden away in homes, siloed as grain, to be fed to the earth once we come to that we can't anymore. Death of language, death of art, death of death, of death, of death. When it does go on, and it must, there will be as many aftermaths as there are lives lived, as different from one another as wound from scar, as elegy from effigy. The word aftermath is an old English farming term referring to grass grown directly after a harvest. There is hope in definition. There's hope in origin. Quarantine comes from the Latin meaning 40 days. How long has it been, and how long will it be? And is it the same kind of 40 as from the Ark and the Flood, the devil in the desert, and the 40-hour work week? How will we will our lives into something more? And I'm going to read Tomas Morin's poem, Vallejo. Really appreciated the speaking to a child in the perspective of the poem, and the lightness of and the tone of speaking to a child in it, and also just the perspective of I have a 10-year-old, and what this time means to process, as a person, but also as a parent, to process what the world, what it looks like, and how we translate it or interpret it or just witness it with our children. Just love the beauty and tone in this poem. Vallejo. You can't just sneeze anywhere anymore. I was pushing you in the stroller when the sidewalk ended, like a roll of floss. I crossed the street, and the old woman walking her Jack Russell said, "Oh, you didn't need to cross." If she had heard one of my monstrous sneezes, followed by your mama saying, "Vallejo," would she have thought it also sounded like I was saying the name of the poet? I swear he looks like a young Abraham Lincoln in the sketches of Picasso. I need some human poems today. Human poem sounds odd, unlike the Poemas Humanos of Cesar Vallejo. That's a title people can get behind. I asked the English language if we could do any better. It shrugged its shoulders and said, "People poems, mankind poems? There are too many dogs in this neighborhood. Where are all the cats? A day with a cat is a master class in keeping your distance from even the ones you love." My cat was 19 years, 10 months, and 3 days old when she died. At least that's the story I tell, since really all I ever knew was the birth date of her 2 kittens. She'd be aces at all this stay home, wash your hands off and business. I wish she was still here, so I could show her the video of the swans and the dolphins swimming in the canals of Venice. Sure, a smarty already proved they were fake. I guess for some people only real hope has value during an apocalypse. I keep thinking about the old woman and her dog. I hope she's okay and doesn't think I was afraid of her. Can you imagine that? All it took was a pandemic to turn the world into a pineapple upside down cake. The virus kind of looks like one, to be honest. Just a block later, I pulled a rose petal and let you smell it. I smelled it first, to show you how. I know you smiled, but maybe it was because I looked so happy breathing that pink petal in so deep. When you opened your mouth, I said, "No, no, no." But I hear some fancy humans do eat roses. I love you, but can you take your sister and please slip away from gravity and the flying saucer of your ba-ba black sheep? I don't want you to see the planet this sad. Tell him to fly around the earth as fast as Superman did in 1978. Your mama was the age you are now when that happened. Looking back, that time doesn't seem so bad anymore. Tell him to fly counterclockwise because the future waits in that direction. You'll like it there. It's safe enough that a dish can still run away with a spoon.
The range of tones in those two poems is so marvelous. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to introduce Carl Phillips, St. Louis poet and professor. He is the author of 15 books of poetry, most recently Pale Colors in a Tall Field from Farrar, Straus and Giroux in 2020. Welcome, Carl.
Hi, Alice. Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, good. Thanks for including me, not only in the anthology, but this is it's exciting to be reading with such a wonderful, diverse crew of poets. And so I'm going to read a poem or two. I'll start with my poem that's in the anthology. It's called Sing a Darkness. I'm actually not able to write towards a subject, so I had just written this poem maybe a week before Alice contacted me, and I thought, I don't think I have any pandemic poems. But then when I looked, in fact, I only have one poem, which was the one I'd just written. And then it was interesting to see how I guess it can be considered a pandemic poem. It mentions the sick and the well towards the end, which I guess is just it's interesting to me to think about how poems sometimes are prescient, I suppose. Anyway, this is called Sing a Darkness. Slowly the fog did what fog does eventually. It lifted, the way veils tend to at some point in epic verse, so that the hero can see the divinity at work constantly behind all things mortal. Or that's the idea anyway. I'm not saying I do or don't believe that. I'm not even sure that belief can change any of it, at least in terms of the facts of how, moment by moment, any life unfurls. We can call it fate, or call it just what happened, what happens, while we're busy trying to describe or explain what happens. How a mimosa tree caught growing close beside a house gets described as hugging the house. For example, as if an impulse to find affection everywhere made us have to put it there, a spell against indifference, as if that were the worst thing. Is it? Isn't it? The fog lifted. It was early spring still. The dogwood brandished those pollen-laden buds that precede a flowering. History. What survives or doesn't. How the healthiest huddled, as much at least as was possible, more closely together, to give the sick more room. How they mostly all died all the same. I was nowhere I'd ever been before. Nothing mattered. I practiced standing as still as I could, for as long as I could. And the next poem I'm going to read is by D. Nurksey, and I mainly want to read it because I love it. But I was also thinking how this line from my own poem, I was nowhere I'd ever been before. Sometimes that's how I feel reading the poems of D. Nurksey. They seem as if they take place in, I have no idea what country, what part of the world, if even in this world. But they usually involve being besieged, having to make one's way through a difficult landscape. And this poem, although it doesn't seem to be specific to this particular pandemic, is very much specific to the pandemic of violence that seems pretty much the human condition, pandemic of fear. So this is his poem. It's called Order to Disperse. Tonight, my children are facing live ammunition. One holds a rock, one brought a Bible, one has a phone. The fires of the provocateurs burn so brightly. The police put duct tape over their badges. The soldiers are hooded. They wear no insignia. Last night, they had rubber bullets. Tonight, Hollow Point. In the smoke, you see the outlines of a bank, a cathedral, absent as the profiles of presidents on coins. A voice advances, a voice retreats. Someone aims. Have you ever died in a dream? What happened then? Tell me what happened. There is only one life. How long will I hold mine like water in cupped hands? Thanks.
Carl, that was wonderful. And I loved hearing John Cady read your poem and the way he spoke about your brilliance at capturing history as a kind of fog about a week ago. Thank you again, Carl. I'm going to introduce Diane Seuss now, who is the author of 5 collections of poetry, including Four-Legged Girl from Grey Wolf and Still Life with 2 Dead Peacocks and a Girl from 2018. Her next book, Frank: Sonnets, is forthcoming from Grey Wolf in 2021.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you everyone who's been beautifully reading tonight. Actually, Frank is out now. I'm going to begin with a poem by Jessie Ball from the anthology, which I love because of its strange, surrealist reversals. It's called Come Back, Come Back. My brother was drowning. I went to where there was no lake and swam to the bottom. He wasn't there. I said, climb on my back. He got on, but he was much too big. All of him could only fit on my finger like a ring. Oh, it was long into the night, and the sun shone, a real blessing. Only there was no one alive to see it. My brother was very old. I hadn't yet been born. The day was perfectly still, and the wind was crying. It said nothing, what anyone would say. I covered my ears so I could hear. Oh, there was no wind. These were the days when babies were born in graves, old men buried in hospital beds. Still, the song came in where my ears weren't. Oh, you who will never leave us, all you, come back, come back. And I'll end with my poem, which is called Pandemicon, which I thought sounded a little like Fellini. And it's sort of a voice, a poem in voice, a kind of soliloquy from a slippery, perhaps reprehensible speaker, i.e. me. I don't want to find meaning in it. The narcissus, I guess I see it more clearly. Its crisp gold corona. I suppose I feel more indebted to it, to flowers in general, how entertaining they are, how they dot the landscape in spring like the new commercials on TV about how we're all in this together. Incredible how America can brand even a pandemic, turn it into a thing. Face masks printed with dragonflies and prints in purple rain. It's a reality series with viral bread recipes and optimism. So this narcissus, Isn't it said the gods made the flowers for us, the grand unified field of us, the us that is grandly unified into a me? And we are to find a way to love them. Flowers, trees, animals, bugs. Most of us don't see amphibians that often or reptiles, except for snakes. Remember when Britney Spears danced at the VMAs with an albino python draped over her shoulders? That was September 6, 2001, 5 days before 9/11. An omen, almost. Brittany didn't know what she was in for. Brittany never knows what she's in for. That was 6 years before she shaved her head. She's not a person who looks good with a shaved head. She just looked the kind of crazy they accused her of. Aaliyah had just died, and Joey Ramone, end of an era. And Fatboy Slim took most of the awards for that video he did with Christopher Walken. But looking back on that video, well, who wants to see someone they know like Christopher Walken? I mean, I don't know him personally, but I watched The Deer Hunter. Those Russian roulette scenes, terrible. Who wants to see him dancing? It's like seeing your next door neighbor's sex tape. Just please, no. But there he was dancing. And then there was that one part where he jumps off the balcony and flies over the hotel lobby. Flies. That was a bit much. And maybe another omen. I'm thinking everything since the 2001 VMAs was an omen of this current situation in which what you touch can contain a little spiked red ball of death. You've seen the photos of the corona online. It looks like a toy my dog would like, to be honest. But it's microscopic, so it could be anywhere and is therefore everywhere, smeared on all the stuff we used to live for, especially each other. We can kill who we touch. We can be killed by who touches us. But wasn't that always true? It was for me. It was for Pan, the only god in the pantheon who dies, who fell in love with Echo, who fell in love with Narcissus, who fell in love with himself and turned into a flower with a gold corona at the center like a crown, like it's royalty or something. And we have to get down on our knees in front of it. An omen, if there ever was one, that we almost have to stop living in order to save our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. And when did the book come out?
It came out March 2nd.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm going to introduce Tess Taylor, who is the author of 5 collections of poetry, including Rift Zone and Last West. She teaches poetry and nonfiction at UC Davis and is the poetry reviewer for NPR's All Things Considered. Tess's first major publication was the chapbook, The Misremembered World, one of the inaugural chapbooks in the Poetry Society of America's distinguished series. Hers was chosen and introduced by Evan Boland, the dedicatee of this anthology, who died suddenly a year ago in Dublin this April, and who, as the director of the writing program at Stanford for some 20 years, encouraged so many poets in the community this anthology represents, and so many whose poems are in it. And Tess, you're going to read a couple of the Rick Barrow poems. I hope you'll read number 10 as one of your 2. So welcome, Tess.
Hi, Alice and everyone. Thanks so much for being here and showing up for poetry, the way that we can share breath in this crazy time. I want to read some poems by Rick Barrett, who wrote these beautiful sequences called During the Pandemic, and there's a lot of them. So I'm just going to read 2. Number 10. During the pandemic, I knew each neighbor by one thing. The neighbors above, the baby. The neighbors below, the dog. Someone down the hall, fried fish. Someone else down the hall, the opera when their door opened. I made my rooms quieter by standing in the middle of each one, my mind moving intently like an old man in slippers. I wondered what one thing the neighbors would know me by, what truth an inadvertence would betray. Number 30. During the pandemic, I had days when I felt I was by myself on a shore drained of the tide, dragging a stick across miles of wet sand. There were also days when I was a boy again, sliding down a snowy hill on a flattened cardboard box. And there were days when I remembered the teacher who made us memorize a poem each week. And when we asked why, she said we might one day find ourselves in a wreck at the side of the road, and we would recite these poems to stay alive. That reminds me of a famous part of the Aeneid where Aeneas's men are in trouble, and Aeneas says to them, "Forsen et haec olim meminissa juvabit." Someday it will help even to remember these things. And I think it's been such a crazy time, sort of wondering what sense to make of it. I actually couldn't get much writing done properly. It was all kind of an insomniac's journal. My 2 kids are under 10, and it was just a very intense load. And we live right near a graveyard. One of the things that we could do when most things were shut down was walk around in a graveyard. And in that graveyard, I started to think of this poem that I'll read you. My grandmother died, and we still haven't been able to bury her. And the thing that's interesting about her life is that she was born during the 1918 pandemic and lost her mother. And so I thought about this event, partly how her loss reverberated through time, and I felt it even, a century later, and what it is to be living through this event that our children and our children's children and our grandchildren will feel. They'll feel it. So anyway, this poem is called Under Juncos, the Baby Stones. And thank you, Alice, for asking me for it. Grandmother, born 1918, half orphaned, mother dead of the flu. Your father, widowed, alone, taped your mouth shut to keep you from crying. You lay in the crib until you could be sent off to relatives. This February, your raw end came. You died on one of the last days your daughters could sing to you. With love, my aunts eased you out, offered hymns to the verge. Now your ashes wait. We cannot meet to bury you. A continent away, I walk in a graveyard. Under juncos, find the 1918 graves. Baby stones fracture in live oak shadows. Pain is a rotting limb in my shoulder. My children grow feral. I feed them and feed them. I scour my cupboards looking for tenderness. You scold me when I can't clean the house. Pour yourself vodka while I fold sheets. Light a cigarette, then follow me quizzically. All these dead, all these dead. How will their great-granddaughters mourn them? No one can answer me in this century. One day I feel your ghost climb inside me. She hurts a torn tree, a broken wing. She uncovers the scar she always was hiding. We are so rusty, we are a broken spigot. All the dead mothers, all the dead mothers, your old pain, this spring wind, my mouth open. I could not cry. Now I howl for you.
Thank you, Tess. Thank you so much. And in the cat's cradle of this book, Jeffrey Yang also has a very moving poem called Stones and Stars Set in a Cemetery up here in the Hudson Valley. So Kevin Young is going to conclude the program. He is the new director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., and as mentioned earlier, poetry editor of The New Yorker. He is the author of 13 books of poetry and prose and the editor most recently of the acclaimed Library of America anthology, African American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song. Thanks for joining us, Kevin.
Thanks, Alice, for having me and everyone else. And thanks so much for editing this anthology. It's so tremendous and such an effort in such a short time, and bringing together all these poets under one roof book. The boards is beautiful. So thank you so much. I'm going to read a poem by David Beispiel called Men Waiting for a Train. It's a poem I picked for The New Yorker, and it's been a real honor to be in that position following in Alice's footsteps. During this time, I get to see a lot of poems by tremendous people. And what's also amazing is the poems that people write even beforehand that in the midst of the pandemic become all the more relevant. You see the ways in which poets are always prophetic, but no more so than now. This is Men Waiting for a Train by David Beispiel. At first they stand, orphaned, like a line of birds, first on one foot, then the other, in unison, like any other unnamed someone's, as if poised for a firing line, until someone thinks he knows a train is coming in the sparrow morning light, and someone else taps a pack of cigarettes against his gloved hand. Not exotic, but it's as if he's slipped into captivity. One of those corner of the eye, white sky days, late winter, a hammer against the platform, and gathered above the grave line of the gap enough snow to consider the blue clouds floating, like forgiveness above us all. Only two are crusting at this moment. One, a show of hands, an explosion of clapping. The other, a mask of a baptismal face, failing behind the city's blood-brown skyline. Whoever screamed just then quieted, then shouted high like a crow, leaves me filled with absence, listening for silences, cupping my ears for a moment. Nothing is being celebrated, nothing undone or measured, nothing moves or rings in the air, and in the next moment, sirens are continually dying in the distance, in the time it takes the train's doors to open and close, and for the train to swirl us all off, half in, half out of our own wills, underground. Something like joy pours out of the cloud-burst heart, and whatever feelings each one of us has had goes off into the daylight without us. And I thought I'd end with two poems of mine. They're kind of little prayers, I suppose. They're poems that I think a lot about Dante in this moment. He was close to mind to me. They're in tercets, like the Inferno or Paradiso. This is more like a Purgatorio, and they come in a sequence that very much tumbled around and seemed to take life during the start of the pandemic. And I think you'll understand why. The first one here, they're short, is called Shine. The stars here shine brighter, and there are lights somewhere saying my name. I know all this, Lord, must go, that even the dark is not there tomorrow. Morning comes too early for me. Who can sleep when the world's emptying? The desert cold, the wild of what goes. And this last poem of mine is called Resurrection. I was dead a while when I woke, rested almost. This world bests us all, I know. How best to live, the living ask, and the dead do too, in whispers. The answer, in the dark, where our talk sounds louder. Bright, bothered death. How I wish to take your hand and tell you to hold again, you like breath. Thank you.
Levin, it is so perfect to end with breath. I thank you so, so much. And thanks for the gorgeous Marilyn Nelson poem you published too. There's so many good poems in the magazine. And thank you again, Shane. Thank the audience for joining us, all the poets.
All right, I'm going to bring everyone back on the screen so that we can have everyone together for screenshots and just a celebration of having all of these incredible voices together at one time. So I'm going to bring everyone in. Everyone, get your smiling faces on for the cameras. I need to remove my...
Where'd Shane go? Isn't he going to be in here?
No, but I think Dante may have had to slip away into his...
No, there's Dante.
bed.
No, I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Oh,
That's the awards.
thank you, Dante, you're stalwart.
Everyone read so well.
Yeah, it was a beautiful reading. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you for having us and making this happen. Thanks, Shane.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a real honor.
Shane.
I love having one moment to say goodbye because it's so awkward just to leave again, you know, because obviously it would be so much nicer to get a glass of wine and hug you all. So till that day.
All right. Well, thank you so much, audience, for joining us.
Stay safe, everyone.
Thanks for
we
the
have
poems.
copies available for sale at Left Bank Books. So have a great evening. I'm going to leave again and bring Dana back on.
Thanks, Shane.
Thanks.
Good to see you guys. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.